Hey there, my name is Eric, and I'm an assistant editor and producer here at Delve, a podcast by the Desautels Faculty of Management of McGill University. So this summer, I'm going to bring you some management tips, lessons, and insights from some of our previous Delve episodes. Since 2019, we've interviewed over 50 experts in management and organizations, most of whom are from right here at McGill University. And each one of these conversations is worth a listen. But I'll pull clips from a few of them that complement each other and that give a fulsome view on important management issues. So today we're going to talk about equity, diversity, and inclusion in hiring. So increasingly, EDI is a priority for leaders in organizations, but that doesn't always translate to a more diverse workforce. According to a 2019 report by the Canadian Centre for Diversity and Inclusion, 91% of senior leaders said they are committed to EDI. But only 40% of their personnel agree that they actually set appropriate goals to improve staff diversity for certain roles. So, while the intention is there, inclusive hiring has not yet become the great equalizer many hoped it would be. But why? Where is the misalignment between leaders' intentions and actual hiring outcomes? And what can be done about it? So for that, we're going to turn to Professors Jeraul Mackey, Brian Rubineau, and Roman Galperin. They are faculty members here at the Desautels Faculty of Management and have extensively studied hiring practices and the barriers to EDI. So at one level, there's the job application itself. From the time you send your CV to the time you receive an offer, there are many opportunities for unconscious bias to rule you out for a job. So any EDI strategy will have to address that. And at a more macro level, the demographic composition of your industry can hurt your efforts to hire diverse candidates. So if men make up most of your available talent pool, you may need a non-typical approach if you want more women applicants, for example. So let's start with the issue of unconscious bias. Roman Galperin is an associate professor of organizational behavior here at the Desautels Faculty of Management. In one of his research papers, he looked into why hiring managers penalize applicants who appear to be overqualified, and he came out with an interesting finding. Women aren't penalized for overqualification as much as men are. This suggests that women, as an underrepresented group in some industries, need extra CV items just to appear qualified, let alone overqualified, which could be an example of bias. So here's a clip of Roman's interview with my colleague Robin Fadden, the managing editor for Delve.
How do your findings about hiring managers' bias, perception, and stereotyping fit in with research on biases around race, gender, and other diversity markers?
Similarly qualified applicants, women will experience different, the expectations for them will be different by hiring managers, and they will be essentially penalized, but because of these stereotypes, on average will be perceived as less committed to their careers. Now, when they're overqualified, this compensates for this penalty, for this perception, because if you went out of your way to get an extra degree or, invested in a particular difficult to get certification or professional license, it signals that you're probably committed to your career. And so that eliminates this penalty. And so in relative terms, women who are overqualified don't experience as much of a backlash in hiring process as men do. This is an interesting, somewhat counterintuitive finding, but it speaks to this idea that stereotypes related to social group membership, so to gender, to race and ethnicity, age, sexual orientation, all of these categories that we care about, those stereotypes apply in the context of overqualification because they enter into this calculation of how well someone's qualifications and commitment will fit with the requirements and the goals of the organization that's hiring a person.
So qualifiers like race, gender, sexual orientation do play a role in the hiring process. A recruiter's bias can affect how they perceive an applicant, like whether they're qualified or overqualified, but bias can seep into the process in many other ways too. So Jeraul Mackey is an assistant professor in organizational behavior here at Desautels, and he studies how this kind of bias plays out during the hiring process. My editor-in-chief, Saku Mantere, sat down with him earlier this year. Here's a clip of what they said.
There's this institutionalized way of speaking about job candidates when you meet in the committee that hires that, do we like this person? It was common lingo to talk about liking a job candidate. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of a loaded term, isn't it? So it brings in a lot of baggage, in particular if we're talking about diversity. How would you react to that?
One of the things that you will notice that is something that plays out across a variety of hiring contexts. So within the context of consulting, for instance, that is often is translated as the airport test. Is this someone who, if there's a snowstorm in Chicago, I feel comfortable being stuck in an airport with them for several hours? So this idea of and you're right, Saku, it introduces this notion of bias. What was my aha moment is that when I'm interviewing someone who is ultra extroverted, I have to have a level of awareness of what are the ways in which I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt because they sort of really play into my own disposition and sort of personality, if you will. And then if someone might be a bit more reserved, what are the ways in which I might actually be overly critical of them because they are more reserved or might not be as expressive? That level of awareness is important for any recruiter to have this sense of when I'm interviewing folks who come from backgrounds or have sets of experiences that are different from mine. How am I aware of that when it comes to evaluation and who I look at in terms of who can be successful?
So as you just heard, Jeraul suggests recruiters to check their biases at the door when interviewing candidates, so that they can avoid common pitfalls like only hiring people who match their personality or share similar interests. So to put that into practice, Jeraul recommends using a standardized set of questions for all your interviewees, a common practice that you might already be aware of. He also recommends going a step further and creating a standardized way of assessing candidates' answers. Then you can make sure that you're judging everyone based on the same criteria, rather than letting your biases warp your judgment. So here's Jeraul again.
Quite often, we have a structure for how we ask the questions, but we may not have a structure for how we assess the questions. And being able to have a structure on assessment can sometimes be more critical than the structure, having the structured interview process. And what I mean by that is that you may ask me, give me an example of how you had to manage multiple projects. If one person pulls from their academic life or their professional life, and another one pulls from their family life or their personal life, we may not have a clear frame or sense for understanding what it means to help your mom or help your parents manage your siblings.
Okay, so what have we learned so far? 1, it's good to investigate your own biases and make sure you're not judging candidates on things that have little or nothing to do with the job. 2, standardize your interview questions and your method for evaluating their answers. And 3, open yourself up to other people's experiences and look for transferable skills. For example, someone who helped raise their siblings in a single-parent household could be a great mentor or a leader for your other employees. Now, all this is fine and good when you have the candidates sitting right in front of you, but these tactics only help if you get applications in the first place. And in some industries, that can be tough. It can be difficult to find candidates with different backgrounds to those you've already hired. So in financial services, for example, women are dramatically underrepresented across the sector, which means fewer women in the talent pool, which in turn means fewer job applications from women. Now this can be a challenge, but based on research by Brian Rubineau, a professor of organizational behavior here at McGill University, there are still some things you can do to mitigate this factor. So here's part of his conversation with my colleague Robin Fadden.
In your research paper, Network Recruitment and the Glass Ceiling, you and your co-authors show that a big part of increasing diversity, equity, and inclusion at work is how people become aware of job positions in the first place. Word of mouth is one of the main ways that people learn about jobs. But what does word of mouth look like in the real world of job recruitment?
Word of mouth is the primary way job seekers connect with employers in the labor market. And this is true in the United States, North America, broadly. It's both the most common recruiting approach that employers use. When there's a vacancy, it's very common for employers to ask their current employees to try to identify good people that would be able to fill the vacancies that organization has. In addition, it's one of the most common search practices of job seekers. In addition to going to online tools and things like that, job seekers will also talk to their contacts, their own social network, to try to say, who do you know that's hiring? What jobs are available out there? And use their contacts to try to identify these opportunities. So it's the most common form of job matching that exists in the labor market. Now, this common form of job matching has some important consequences because one of the things we know, one of the most reliable findings in social science, is that our social contacts tend to resemble ourselves along many different dimensions of similarity. Gender, level of education, race, religion, language preference, a whole range of dimensions. Our social contacts tend to be similar to ourselves. And so organizations that use word of mouth practices to try to fill their vacancies, which again is one of the most common forms of recruiting, it has obvious implications for diversity.
I can see how that could have either negative or positive implications depending on the composition of a workplace. But what does research, including your own, show about the current impact of word-of-mouth recruitment on diversity?
The assumed relationship does not actually hold. So for a long time, the perception was that, this was the old boys network, right? The idea that if you have, say, mostly men in an organization and you have word-of-mouth recruiting, that they're going to replace themselves with mostly men. Now, that tendency is there. And actually, in the 1970s, a scholar named Rosabeth Moss-Kanter, who's at Harvard Business School, coined the term homosocial reproduction, the idea that the current generation of organizational members are reproducing and creating the next generation of organizational members. And because they're creating the next generation is very similar to themselves, it's this homosocial reproduction aspect. But there's also this possibility of introducing difference. And so just to give you an example of that, if you have mostly men in an upper levels of an organization and the men generate the kind of word of mouth contacts that they generate as new employees are 90% male like themselves, and only 10% of the people they generate are female. Well, those 10% female contacts that are generated, those 10% applicants that are generated, those that are hired will then become able to reproduce themselves. And women are also more likely to produce other women in this kind of homosocial reproduction dynamic. And so the process can actually be a tool towards integration, towards desegregation. One of the insights of my earlier research was that if you can get underrepresented groups to refer, we call the word of mouth recruiting sometimes referrals and referring. If you can get underrepresented groups to refer more, then you can turn this reproductive process into an integrating process so that an underrepresented group can actually become more integrated and you can desegregate a workplace that way.
So word of mouth is already one of the most common ways people hear about and connect to jobs. When there's an opening, managers invite people who have a similar profile to themselves to apply, which aligns with what Jeraul told us earlier. He said managers often hire people based on their shared personality traits, similar backgrounds, and perceived social compatibility, all things that are influenced by personal bias. And here, with word-of-mouth hiring, we can see the effects of personal bias before the interview process even begins. Candidates who are invited to apply will have an advantage in terms of compatibility because they're more likely to already match the profile of their hiring manager. Plus, people who are referred to a job are more likely to get an interview in the first place. Their applications go to the top of the pile, while others hope their experience is enough to land them an interview. So where do we go from here? Well, when it comes to word-of-mouth recruiting, Brian suggests making it work in favor of diverse applications. The theory goes, if people are more likely to recruit people like themselves, why don't you ask your current employees with diverse backgrounds, even if there's just a few of them, to start referring candidates? So if a woman refers other women for a role, it should help boost the number of women who overall apply to a posting and eventually work at an organization. So does this kind of policy work? Well, thankfully, Brian looked into that, so here he is again.
I collected data from several organizations that were using word-of-mouth recruitment for their recruitment policies. Whether they were trying to use it to promote diversity or not was largely irrelevant. But we were trying to identify what the effects of the word-of-mouth recruitment were for the demographic composition of the organization, so we could follow some organizations over time and see what was happening. What we found was a bit surprising. We kind of had these slightly contradictory findings. On the one hand, more word-of-mouth recruitment was generating more integration, was desegregating the workforce. But we were finding the strongest effects at the lowest levels of an organization and the least strong effects at the highest levels of the organization. And so what the problem was when we actually looked for the data supporting the research that we had come up with in our findings from our mathematical and computational models, we were finding that to some extent, the processes we were observing were still recreating a glass ceiling phenomenon where women appeared to have more barriers as you went higher levels in the organization. One of the things that we had missed was that in our models, there's this principle in modeling that you keep things as simple as possible, but no simpler. And so we had in our models, we were looking at organizations with only one job. And so we kind of had this idealized organization with just one job, and we were looking at the gender composition in those single job organizations. Real organizations have multiple jobs and multiple levels. And one of the processes that highly influences the gender integrating effects of word-of-mouth recruitment is the fact that not only do people tend to reproduce job candidates who are like themselves, but there's a level of the organization dynamic that comes into play. And that is when we refer others for job opportunities, we tend to refer others for jobs that are at our level or below. And very rarely do we refer others for job opportunities that are at a higher level than our own job. And because we have this level specific referring tendency, then the upper levels of the organization, which tend to be more male dominated than the lower levels of the organization, preserve that male domination, that male overrepresentation. It's more enduring than it is for lower levels of the organization. So the integrating effects of word-of-mouth recruitment are strongest at the lowest level and weakest at the upper level. And so that revealed a limitation in the opportunities of using word-of-mouth recruitment to promote diversity, because it's going to work best for the lowest levels. And the lowest levels are already the ones that tend to be most gender integrated. And it's less effective to promote integration at the highest levels of the organization.
So an improved word-of-mouth strategy can boost applications from diverse groups, but it's not a silver bullet. So, to recap, Jeraul suggested creating a standardized list of interview questions, a standard method for evaluating them, and Brian adds another practical insight. He says that, where possible, recruiters should actually invite candidates for a job tryout or a skills test. So if you're hiring a graphic designer, for example, you might ask them to send samples of their work or to create something specifically for the hiring process. Then you can evaluate them based on their work, rather than solely on your interactions in the job interview, where bias is like to seep in. Now, that's a full lid, so I'm going to leave it there, and hopefully you learned something from the show today. Improving EDI is not an easy task, but hopefully these recommendations can help you improve your EDI hiring strategies. So if you want to learn more about Jeraul, Brian, or Roman, their full interviews are linked in the show notes, and you'll also find links to the research papers used to build this episode. And if you liked what you heard, I hope you'll participate in our little word-of-mouth strategy and tell a friend about the show. We love connecting with new listeners and sharing the management insights produced here at McGill University. Delve is the official thought leadership platform for the Desautels Faculty of Management. This episode pulled from previous interviews conducted by Saku Mantere and Robin Fadden. My name is Eric Dicaire, and I was your narrator today. And I also edited and mixed this episode. And finally, Saku Mantere produced all the original music. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.